Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Inclusionary zoning, what the heck is that? Is probably a question that a lot of you might be asking. I read a really interesting and well-written column on the weekend on inclusionary zoning, penned by David Wilkes, who is the president and CEO of the Building Industry and Land Development Association of Ontario. BILD, for short, is an active participant in discussions about everything to do with housing and development and housing policy. And I think is interested in enhancing the housing supply in the GTA and affordability in the GTA. But inclusionary zoning, which is a new proposal by the City of Toronto, is something that might change things fairly dramatically. And so I thought that it would be really helpful to have Dave join us, explain to us what it's all about, what the issues are, and what BILD's point of view is. Dave, how are you? Welcome to our show.
I am great, Brian. Thank you very much for having me back. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Excellent. So maybe just before we get into inclusionary zoning, tell me what and who is BILD?
All right. BILD, our acronym stands for the Building Industry and Land Development Association. So we represent builders, developers, professional renovators, and the various companies and agencies that support our industry across the GTA. We have approximately 1,300 members, and our members, basically build the GTA, both from a residential and a non-residential perspective. So it's a very active industry, and it's one that I'm very proud to represent.
Excellent. And how long have you been head of BILD?
Yeah, so it seems like a lot longer, but I'm coming up on 3.5 years. It's been quite the ride, as obviously the last couple of years for everybody has been a very interesting one. But the housing industry in particular has really been at the center of a lot of interesting discussions around supply, around affordability, working through the pandemic and making sure that the industry works safely. As we look at how the commercial side of the business is changing as well, Brian. What's the future of retail? What does that look like? How do we do mixed use? More, the need for more industrial spaces around distribution centers as we evolve into a different way of shopping. So it's a very exciting industry, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to work here.
Well, it sounds like we could do an actual series of shows on different topics, given that description of issues. But let's talk about affordability and specifically inclusionary zoning. So the City of Toronto has come forward with some policy proposals to try to address affordability. Can you explain to us what inclusionary zoning is, and does it address affordability?
Yeah, thank you very much. And inclusionary zoning is probably the worst title you could give to something like this, because every now and then I said, who came up with that term? What does it mean? And so let me, for your listeners, maybe just step back and define what inclusionary zoning is, because quite frankly, my neighbor, when they read the column you referred to on the weekend, came up to me and said, I have no idea what you're talking about, right? So it's a bit of a challenge, as you said, but it's an incredibly important issue, right? Inclusionary zoning refers to including below market or housing within zoning requirements for particular developments, if you boil it right down. So it's a tool that has been used across cities in North America. It's a tool that's been discussed in the province of Ontario for several years right now as a way to incent the inclusion of below market units in particular developments. So it's a way to address affordability, if you will. So hopefully that's a simple explanation. Where we are today is the province of Ontario had passed legislation that allowed municipalities to implement inclusionary zoning policies. They have indicated where those policies should be located around major transit areas. So, subway developments, GO train developments, and those types of areas that they should be focused on those. But the definition of how they get implemented beyond that is really left to each municipality. The City of Toronto is the first out of the gate looking at how to implement the policies. And that's where a lot of the focus and a lot of the precedent will be set in the province, determining on how the city moves forward.
And so this is not everywhere. It's just in major transit nodes. Is that correct?
Yeah, basically that's correct. Yeah.
Really? I thought, I guess I misunderstood. I thought it was going to be a requirement to have affordability baked into developments everywhere. So this is not across the GTA. This is across Toronto, only in major transit node areas?
So it can be done across the province in major transit areas. I mean, the definition will vary. In Mississauga, for example, out your neck of the woods there are various major transit areas that could be developed. There could be in Durham, as we look at the GO train, you get an other where there are major transit nodes. But for it is focused around that type of type of development, if you will. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought there. So
what there is there's going to be a requirement to build a certain amount of what you describe as below market, but more affordable units. Who's going to pay for that?
Well, that's the great question. So as you look at the way that other jurisdictions have done that, and that's where, Toronto's current approach, and Toronto, to their credit, has indicated they're going to continue consultations on this proposal over the summer. They were initially looking for bringing recommendations forward in June to the City Council in Toronto. They are taking some additional time to make sure that they get it right, and now looking at the fall to bring forward proposals, probably in September. But one of the concerns that we had with the city's approach is other jurisdictions that have implemented inclusionary zoning across North America have done it very differently than the city is considering. So to pay for it, there's offsets. So if a building was originally going to be 10 stories, if 10% of those units within the building had to be below market housing, perhaps you allow density bonusing, if you will, to increase the size of the building to balance the needs that are created, or the financial implications that are created by those affordable units. Perhaps you allow breaks from development charges. Perhaps you allow breaks from parkland charges, many of the other costs that are layered on development. But without those offsets, Brian, ultimately who's going to pay for this is the consumer. And based on the current approach that are lacking some of the what we believe are necessities of a good partnership model for inclusionary zoning, it could ask, over 100,000 cost per unit to a development, that didn't have those offsets, as the industry calls them.
And so therefore the comment that I've received from some people is that if that's the case, all that you do is in effect create more unaffordable housing in Toronto, because what would have been rented out or sold at X price has now got to be X plus plus, because it's got to add in the return to compensate for the below market units. And then those below market units end up being these units that, are always below market, and it's luck of the draw if you get them. And then, it's going to be key money if you want to, get them secondhand.
Right. And so there's a couple of challenges with the current approach. One, it doesn't structure in a way to compensate for the costs assorted for those affordable units. So where do those costs flow if they're not compensated for? You're exactly right. It could increase overall costs within those development areas. And what we're also very concerned about, if the pro formas don't work, if the banks look for about a 12% return on development projects to fund them, and they're multi-million, if not billion-dollar projects. If the budgets aren't so that you can get that return because you're having to offer 10, 20, 30% of the units in a development below cost or below market, then it doesn't make sense. The math doesn't work. The projects don't get built because they can't get the financing for them, Brian. And ultimately what you're doing is you're either increasing costs for units that are getting built, or you're robbing supply because the units, you can't make the financing work. And so we're exactly where we should be having increased density around major transit areas. You're going to have less density. And
sounds like it's a big issue. We're going to take a break and come back in just a minute, talking about affordable housing in Toronto and inclusionary zoning with the head of BILD, David Wilkes. We're going to take a break in just a second. Come back to us. We're talking inclusionary zoning on the Brian Crombie Radio Hour tonight with David Wilkes, who is the president and CEO of the Building Industry and Land Development Association, BILD, which is the organization that developers and contractors and builders are part of in the Greater Toronto Area. And he's penned a column this past weekend that I read, and I thought that you would all benefit from understanding the issue, because it either is going to make more affordable housing available if it works, or frankly, it could be government getting involved in the market and again, complicating things, messing things up, and making things less affordable. So David, let me just start from 50,000 square feet or 50,000 feet, if I could. The word was that there were more cranes in Toronto in the last 2 years than in any other city in all of North America building condos. And we've all seen it. And the condo development has been, unbelievable. And yet housing prices have gone up dramatically. Why is it that if we have this increase in supply, this incredible increase in supply, we've still got unaffordability? We've still got housing prices. Is it as simple as the demand is outstripping supply?
Yes, short answer. So you're right. The amount of development in the city has continues to be strong. One of the things we saw during the pandemic, Brian, was a changing in the buying intentions of people. We saw single family homes in the surrounding areas in the 905, as the terminology goes, off the charts. Really incredible sales numbers where people were looking for that race for space as our homes became more than shelter, as they became offices and entertainment centers. People look for more space. That resulted in numbers that we've never seen with new home sales in the single family units, 20-year history. Condos at the same time were doing okay. They're a little bit below where they are usually on a 10-year average. But what I find incredibly interesting, over the last month, we have seen the condo sales once again reach record numbers. The highest that Altus, who tracks sales for us, has ever seen in the last 20-year period. So what the combination that tells me is incredibly strong single-family sales, rebounding condo sales, a lot of activity, prices continuing to move upward, is that we have a market that is fundamentally out of balance. And so my short answer is, do we not have enough supply to meet the demand? It remains the accurate and concise one. Yes, we need more supply. We did a study that looked at, based on provincial projections, how much housing we need and how much housing was being built based on some growth projections. We're 110,000 units short over a 15-year period.
110,000 in what? In Greater Toronto or Toronto?
Greater Toronto area, and that was as of 2019. The numbers have not stopped from there. Brian, the other number that is inescapable, based on projections of how the GTA will grow, 4.4 million more people are coming to this area by 2051. We need more housing in order to support it.
Hold it. So I've heard the statistic of a city the size of Montreal is moving to Toronto in the next 5 to 10 years. That would be about 1 to 2 million people. You're talking about 4.4 million people in the next 20 to 25 years.
The next 30 years, according to the province of Ontario growth projections. So yeah, it's a city, it's a region that is booming. It is a region that is undersupplied from housing.
That's a 50% increase in size.
Yeah, it's phenomenal. When you stop and recognize the numbers that are being projected for the growth and what that means for the demands on infrastructure, the demands on housing, the demands on commercial spaces. And you also recognize, Brian, as you and I have chatted in the past, it takes 10 to 11 years for projects to be, from start to finish. We got to get started now on making changes that will ensure that we have the supply we need for housing, whatever that looks like, yesterday.
So if it takes 10 to 11 years for a project to get started and the zoning building approval process of that is how many? 2 or 3 or 4?
It varies depending on municipalities. Some municipalities are much quicker and much more efficient than others. It can, anywhere from 2 to 5 years.
So if you're talking about a couple $100 million project and you got 2 to 5 years, just the present value, just the interest carry on that alone is tens to 20s of millions of dollars, is it not?
Yeah, absolutely, it is. We've done a bunch of studies, and I'd love to continue to chat with you about these. Well, another one that we looked at was what was the cost of delays from in municipal approvals across the GTA, and we looked at how municipalities across the GTA and if they were meeting the provincially mandated approval timeframes. No one was. Some were better, some were worse, but in all cases, the delay were adding costs, not only, as you said, in carrying costs for the interest on the loan to finance it, on the property taxes associated with that land and continuing to pay for them, on any escalation that might occur on supplies. Certainly, we've seen some really wicked changes in the price of lumber over the last little while, that more variable than long term. So all these costs do add to additional factors that will rise the cost of housing. And then, the other big thing is that we continue to see government fees and taxes and the percent that they account for in the cost of housing at that 20 to 25%. So new development is taxed incredibly heavily. It takes a long time for the process to get underway and completed, which adds more costs. And then something like inclusionary zoning that we were talking about in the first segment, if it isn't done through a partnership model with an offsets for the costs that the development will incur, it's going to add even more costs, which could push the total government take to around 30%.
Which, if it is passed on to the consumer, makes housing less affordable. And so therefore it's defeating the purpose of what it was intended to achieve in the beginning. Is that not correct?
Yeah. Absolutely. So we did some forecasting on what the current structure of the City of Toronto's model would look like, and based on some numbers, once it's done by outside experts from Altus, it could add up to 116,000 for those units in the major transit zones that are not part of the inclusionary zoning program.
So I've heard rumors of some developers trying to get projects approved that they want to get approved this year so that they get in ahead of the inclusionary zoning that aren't as well planned, as nicely designed. They're not going to go through all the work that they would typically do to make sure that it's perfect, just because they're trying to escape government regulation. And so we're going to end up with inferior product in the marketplace. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And yes and no. I haven't heard about inferior product coming to the marketplace. I think all the various steps along the planning process will provide integrity to the projects in the long term. One of the things that we're working with is understanding the transition rules and when these policies will apply from once they're approved by various municipal councils. So I think it would be reasonable to expect that if a particular council approves something on this day and they apply a year later, I mean, it makes sense to try and make investments that are hundreds of millions or $1 billion in advance of those rules applying. It also makes sense that we have transition rules, because once again, if a policy comes into place, if a project has already got financing to support that, if the rules change, it will put at risk that financing and put at risk that project for that much needed housing. So it really is a cascading and a snowball that, as you look at changes that impact the financial integrity of particular projects of hundreds of millions of dollars that are bringing in needed supply that could be passed along to the consumer, you have to do so in a no surprise environment that allows a heads up that it's coming, if you will, Brian, and a transition process to allow projects to adjust. So if 10%, 20%, 30% of the units are supposed to be designated within inclusionary zoning or below market costing, perhaps you phase into that. Don't do it all at once as well. These are all types of the discussions that we're having with the city, and we're looking forward to continuing them.
So, it just doesn't make sense to me. If what you want to do is you want developers to build more affordable housing, rather than making it a mandate or a restriction somehow that they have to do it, why don't you give them an incentive to do it? Why don't you reduce taxes or reduce development fees or reduce something or speed up the time frame for approval? Or, as you said earlier, give them an extra couple of floors that the zoning wouldn't have. Like, what don't incentives work better than restrictive regulations?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what we call offsets, right? So you offset the costs that are being incurred. So absolutely. And I think the bigger question, Brian, and this is a pretty fundamental mine with it, is the responsibility for affordable housing or below market housing. Where does that rest? Does that rest on new home buyers and new home developments in certain areas of the city around major transit areas? Or is that more of a citywide and municipality wide? Should that be something where the costs for affordable housing are put on the entire tax base, as an example, and that the subsidies or the incentives that the developer needs to build those are provided through a citywide application rather than a very targeted one where it's impacting only a very few? I think that's the fundamental question that we need to ask ourselves. Is this the right approach? There is no doubt we need to build affordable housing for those that are called the GTA home in the manner that which inclusionary zoning anticipates. We know that right structure of inclusionary zoning has a partnership model, has those offsets, has the appropriate implementation and time and transition timeframes, and that we look at how long the policy applies to the units that have been designated. That is a fundamental need that we have, but I think the more fundamental need, should it be on the backs of the new homeowners in these areas, or should it be an overall societal responsibility?
And when you think about it, overall society is creating the problem because, to a certain extent, it's NIMBYism. It's people's attitudes that restrict the building of new density, particularly new affordable density in their areas. That makes it difficult to get approval for projects and/or increases the length of time to increase projects. And when you think about a typical homeowner, they don't necessarily want anything nearby that's going to depreciate their home value. And so therefore, if there is, a huge amount of increase in supply or a massive amount of affordable housing, those things would logically negatively impact their home value, wouldn't it?
No, I think change is always difficult. That I will agree with you. There's no question change is difficult. People are used to their environment. But in many cases, new development brings new energy. They bring, a resurgence to areas. There's areas where there's a need for a regeneration of a particular block or building area. So I think the premise that and the bias, if you will, that comes with affordable housing is one that is not one that I support. We also recognize that regardless of the structure and regardless of the financial implications, the current model of inclusionary zoning has a combination of market and below market units. So it is a different way of approaching it. It is in a way that I think is a healthy way with the financial concerns that we've talked about set aside. So I think investing in communities and what that brings with it is a really important part of a growing region. But I also recognize how difficult change is for people that have lived in particular communities that are structured in a particular way for decades.
So you accept that NIMBYism is potentially a cost, but what your pitch is that the NIMBYs are wrong effectively, that they shouldn't be thinking about the negative attitude, the negative impact of more housing and or more affordable housing. They should think about it as something that brings new energy to their communities.
Yeah, I think wrong is a harsh word because that's I'm not trying to split hairs, Brian, but I understand that the difficulty associated with change. I understand that people like what they understand. Part of the reason that you see such extensive consultation when new developments are undertaken is so that people understand what's coming and what the change is and how it could be positive and how it is going to impact their community. And perhaps with new people, you get new restaurants and new other areas that new other businesses and services to support the growing demand in the region. So I think that it's important not to come with a bias around what change will be, because change can often be positive, and that, in my mind, is certainly the case as it relates to new development.
Okay, so change is good, brings new energy to a community. Your argument is that it should be the cost of affordable housing should be borne by society in general, by all taxpayers, not necessarily just by new developments and therefore new home buyers. So how do we have it paid by all taxpayers then?
Well, I mean, I think that if you put it across the property tax base, there could be funds generated through that tax base that are targeted to support affordable housing. I think what developers are very good at is building homes, building new condo, new apartment developments. So I think if you focus on what people are good at, whereas the industry builds the units that are required, and the government support the need for affordable housing through as broad a base tax approach as possible, then I think that is the right model. If that is not a model that makes sense, if there is not a model to apply the costs across a broad property tax base and the taxes that the city collects through the property tax, then an inclusionary zoning model must include offsets that we've talked about, must be a partnership between the industry and the government, must provide those long lead times and the transitions to adjust. It can't be a blunt instrument, because my experience with blunt instruments is they don't work. It needs to be a partnership. And so I really think the fundamental question is the one that we've been discussing. It's not the need for affordable housing or below market housing, but it's how it's paid for, and making sure whatever mechanism to pay for it is done so based on best practices that we've seen across North America and cities and municipalities that have implemented, and the fundamentals that I've talked about, the partnership, the right offsets, the right timing, and the ongoing maintenance of it. Those things have to be front and center, and those are the discussions we're currently having with the City of Toronto.
Well, I encourage you to continue those, because I tend to agree with you. But I do think that supply is a huge issue, and we're going to take a break and come back and talk a little bit more about supply issues in the Greater Toronto Area, particularly if we think about 4.5 million people coming here in the next 30 years. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. We're chatting with David Wilkes, who is the president and CEO of BILD, the Building Industry Land Development Association here in the Greater Toronto Area, that developers and builders and contractors, people interested in what's going on from a building standpoint, get together in an association to exchange best practices and to lobby government and to do research, etc. David, I used to be in the healthcare business. And I've interviewed a couple of people that have talked about what the success is of getting vaccines developed. And they've said that, we changed things dramatically in regards to our interaction with government. Clearly, we had a need. We had a huge need for people that needed vaccines. But what the different regulatory agencies did is they sped up their review and approval of everything because it was beneficial. So the submissions to do trials sped up, the review of the trials sped up, everything in regards to government regulatory. They didn't change their regulatory approvals. They didn't make it less, rigorous. They just sped it up. So that was number one. Number two, what they did is they contracted for output, which reduced some of the risk that the market had. So they entered into big contracts with Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, et cetera, because, that reduced the risk. And then number three, what they did is they then bought it and supplied it. And as you know, in most G7 countries, vaccines are provided for free. So in the past, getting vaccines, getting drugs approved and launched in the marketplace has cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Is there any analogy there for what we need to do in real estate? Number one, speeding up the approval process, not changing it, not making it less rigorous, but speeding it up. Is that number one? And number two, should government actually, make it easy by contracting to buy some of these affordable buildings and then taking and going into the rental, and CMHC and housing and things like that sort of does that with financing. And then, number three, when you think about housing and pharmaceuticals and education, we're making it available to people. Should government, as you say, society be doing a better job? And maybe it's not getting it free, but should government be paying the difference between market rates and the rates that they want to supply to people that are in need. So my question to you is, should the government be doing anything comparable to what we've done in speeding up vaccines? And, just to underline it, vaccines are here in half the time that we thought they would be.
There's a lot there, Brian. I love your example and your comparative to vaccine development and housing supply. I always like to start for the listeners' benefits with a very short answer, and that is, again, yes. I think, if I may, and not my area of expertise, just as a citizen of this country and a proud Canadian, a proud Ontarian, a proud resident of the GTA, I think it's been remarkable the work that's been done on vaccines. I think it is a modern miracle, and I commend governments, working without a roadmap, working without any precedent of getting us to where we are. I mean, it's been too long, no matter how long it's been, but it's been remarkably fast. And we're talking here on, the last half of the year. We're not even 18 months into the declaration of the pandemic by the World Health Organization, and we're already debating around when are we getting our second doses of vaccines. I mean, we have a lot to be grateful for in this country, and that's one of them. But if I get off my bully pulpit as a citizen and talk about that in housing, exactly. We can be better. We can take less time than the 10 to 11 years that I've talked about that it takes from, beginning to end for new developments, and the costs that are associated with that. And we have seen, and I will give full credit to our municipal partners, a lot of innovation, a lot of willingness to do things differently. And I think one of the lasting legacies we have from this pandemic is people are thinking, how do I get to yes, as opposed to how do I get to no? Which again is exactly what happened with vaccine development. So, once again, we'll talk about the City of Toronto because we've been focusing a lot on that in our conversation. There has been a tremendous effort on speeding up approvals. There's been tremendous effort of working with industry to speed up approvals. We also have a responsibility as an industry to make sure the development applications that we have are submitted properly and are clean and are complete and are, provide the information that planners at the various municipalities across the GTA need to make the decisions they make to ensure that it's meeting the zoning requirements. Some municipalities are doing a great job of working with the development community to provide guidance before applications are made so that they know what's to be looking for, what is being looked for, excuse me. But there is absolutely no doubt that what's happened with vaccine can and should happen in housing. And what I'm very pleased about it is happening with a willingness that I haven't seen before with our municipal partners. So I'm quite hopeful in that regard, because it gets back to that fundamental truth. We need more housing, and one way to do it is to speed up approvals, just like we needed vaccines.
Okay, so let me ask you a couple of quick questions that I could. If supply is the issue, how do we get more supply, particularly given that we've had supposedly more cranes in Toronto than any other city in North America? So some of the people that I've talked to over the course of the last year have made some suggestions. I'd like to hear what your reactions. Jennifer Keesmet, the former chief planner for the City of Toronto, said, we made the right decisions on zoning on Yonge Street, but we didn't do it on Bloor-Danforth. When we built the Bloor-Danforth line, we should have increased the zoning at major transit terminals, transit stops along Bloor-Danforth that would allow the creation of Yonge and Eglinton's, Yonge Sheppard type developments at major stops along Bloor-Danforth. What do you think of that?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we could do is as a right zoning. So if a particular area, whether it's Bloor-Danforth or Yonge and Eglinton, the examples that you've given, Brian, if a project's been approved that has 15 stories or whatever it might be, another project with that same footprint and number of stories, that should have a speedier approval process than the first one, because to a certain extent, why are you duplicating that work? I do think there needs to be areas designated across the GTA and in the city where we are going to have increased density. Transit corridors are the absolute right place for it to be, and the city has done a lot of that work where we have designated around GO train lines, around subway lines for increased density, and we're seeing that not only in Yonge and Eglinton, not only along Bloor Danforth, but we're seeing that up, on the Shepherd Extension. Sorry, I forgot the name of it briefly there. And you are seeing some increased density there. That is where the growth has to happen. You look at cities across the world, and when they build new transit, when they make investments of public money in infrastructure, they do so by also working with the development community to make sure that there's development that support that transit by having people live there. So it eliminates the need for cars. It maximizes the benefit of that infrastructure investment around transit, for housing. So the short answer, again, I'm saying that same short answer a number of times, is yes, we need to do that. And yes, the tools exist within the Planning Act to do so. And the as of right zoning is one of them, and designating areas for growth. But if we take it away from transit, what we also have to do, because not everybody wants to live on a subway corridor. Not everyone wants to live, with access to downtown. For areas in the surrounding areas in 905, we also need to be designating land for growth now. So we need to be saying that this is where new growth will happen as we have those 4.4 million people coming in the next 30 years. Let's make the investments in infrastructure that support the need for that housing, and let's make those decisions now. That's the other conversations that we're having with municipalities across the region.
I spoke with a planner who talked on this issue, and he said two things, and I'd like your reaction if I could. Number one, what he said is that, Brian, stop focusing on green belt. The issue is the gray belt, which is an area inside the green belt that is primarily low density industrial and retail and parking lots and things like this, where the official plans of the local municipalities aren't anywhere close to the density in the places to go legislation of the last government, and have lots of room for increased development. And then second of all, he said that this proposed Highway 413, it's this new bypass around Toronto outside of the 407, he said, we'll make affordable housing and the dream that everyone has of a single family home available. And he says, if you don't have that, then forget about single family homes as a dream for people under the age of 40.
I think he's on the right track. I'm not sure about the outcome about forgetting about the dream, but there is a lot of land for development within the GTA. Once again, the terms used by the industry and the planning community is the yellow belt, which is areas within urbanized areas. There's the white belt, with those adjacent to those urban areas, those areas that have been designated for growth. That's where I think we need to be focusing a lot of our planning attention. And then completely agree, the green belt, we've indicated as our industry position, and development in the green belt is something that is not part of what we're advocating for. That green belt has been set aside by the Ford government as a protected zone, and we recognize and appreciate that, and there's no change that we're advocating for. With the 413, I also think it's a really important discussion to have on, as we have the growth, the last, it's BILD's 100th anniversary this year, Brian. And what we've done is look back over the last 100 years, and we've done a series of decade by decade reviews of the decision and the planning that's happened to get to the GTA to where it is now. The last big time we invested, save and except 407, money in highway systems was probably 30 or 40 years ago. If we don't start investing in things like the 413, et cetera, now, we're going to have even more gridlock than we currently have when people return to normal travel patterns.
The Canadian Chamber of Commerce came out with a report that you may have seen just a couple of weeks ago that said that the Toronto financial sector was now the second largest in North America. That is now bigger than Chicago and Los Angeles. So not as big as New York, but bigger than all the other cities, and the second fastest growing. And that to fuel that, to keep it going, we need to have more housing. And they did this description of employment districts in the Greater Toronto Area, and downtown was by far the largest. But I was shocked and surprised to see that the second largest employment zone in all of Canada is the area around the airport, the corporate west center, all the warehouses and manufacturing and distribution that are southwest and north of Pearson. And their comment was, we're not doing the right things for that, both in regards to transit, but also, as you mentioned, highway construction. And they mentioned the issue in regards to truck transit, and that we're not doing the right things to make sure that we've got transportation for trucks. What do you think about that?
Yeah, as we said off the top, I think I agree. The whole changing nature of the way that we live and the delivery environment that we have, and the need for increased distribution centers, and the need for land to support those, and then the need for transportation infrastructure to support that delivery. Absolutely, we need to be thinking about that now. And that's why I think the number one message that I hope your listeners take away from this discussion is the market is out of balance. The demand is not decreasing. Indeed, it will probably increase. We need more supply. We need more infrastructure. We have to work in partnerships with governments at the provincial and municipal level to provide that, to provide the affordable or below market housing as well. But if we don't having serious conversations now to the demands that are going to be placed on the region from a housing and employment space perspective in the decades to come as we grow, as we've described, we all have lost valuable time that we need.
David Wilkes, President, Chief Executive Officer of the Building Industry and Land Development Association in the Greater Toronto Area. Thank you so much for talking to us today about the housing business, about affordability, about inclusionary zoning, and explaining that concept to us. I think bottom line, what you're saying is that you can't just have the requirement for affordable housing to be placed on new home buyers. It should be something that is shared by all of society. And I agree with that. And I think that my bigger issue, I agree with that, but I also think that increasing supply and increasing the rapidity of approvals and decreasing the approval time periods is key. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's always a pleasure, anytime.
Thanks, David.